You think drug culture is wild today. The Romans were getting absolutely obliterated on substances that would make your jaw drop. We're talking about emperors microdosing opium while running an empire, soldiers huffing hallucinogenic smoke before battle, and an entire civilization where drug dealers operated storefronts right next to your local bread vendor. What I'm about to show you will completely shatter everything you thought you knew about ancient Rome. Because while Hollywood shows you gladiators and politics, the real Roman Empire was powered by a drug trade so sophisticated it puts modern cartels to shame. And here's the kicker. By the end of this video, you'll discover which philosophical emperor was secretly a functioning opium addict, how Nero turned an entire lake into a city-wide orgy, and why Roman soldiers collected seashells as spoils of war while completely high out of their minds.
Picture this. You're walking through ancient Rome, and you notice something's off. That senator over there, he's giggling at his own shadow because he just ate cannabis cakes at a dinner party. That group of soldiers, they're staring at clouds like they're watching the most fascinating movie ever made after smoking mystery herbs. That wealthy merchant, he just tried to pay for bread with his own sandal because he's been sipping wine laced with Mandrake. Welcome to the Roman Empire, where everyone from slaves to emperors was absolutely blazed out of their minds on a pharmacopoeia that would terrify modern chemists. See, when your daily entertainment involves watching people get torn apart by lions, dodging plagues that wipe out half your city, and wondering if barbarians are going to burn down your house tomorrow, you develop some pretty intense coping strategies. But here's the part that'll blow your mind. Romans didn't just casually use drugs, they turned getting high into a science. We're talking about a civilization that mixed cannabis, opium, and henbane into designer cocktails, used mad honey as biological warfare, and had emperors who were so dependent on opiates they couldn't function without their daily dose. By the time we're done, you'll know exactly which Roman emperor staged his own funeral while high, which substances were used to assassinate rivals at dinner parties, and how the most powerful man in the ancient world became a hardcore drug addict while preaching self-control. Trust me, your history teacher never told you any of this.
Forget everything you know about underground drug dealers. In ancient Rome, drug vendors had storefronts with window displays. They set up shop right between the olive oil guy and the spice merchant, advertising their mind-melting products like they were selling pottery. Walk up to a Roman drug dealer and the conversation went like this. "Hey, buddy, want some Egyptian opium? I've got 3 grades. Take this much if you just want to sleep, this much if you want to forget your problems exist, and this much if you want to slip away from this life on a gentle wave forever." They weren't just selling drugs, they were providing customer service, detailed dosing instructions, preparation methods, even mixing recommendations to achieve the perfect high. But here's where it gets absolutely insane. They were running designer drug laboratories 2,000 years ago. Archaeologists found jars near Pompeii filled with a cocktail that would send modern DEA agents into total panic mode. Cannabis, opium, and henbane, all mixed together in precise ratios. Think about that. While most of Europe was figuring out basic farming, Romans were creating custom drug combinations that would make Breaking Bad look like a cooking show. They understood drug tolerance, documented withdrawal symptoms, and were basically doing addiction science before we even had words for these concepts. One ancient scholar named Theophrastus was already documenting that users needed bigger and bigger doses to get the same effect. They had figured out the entire cycle of addiction, tolerance, dependency, withdrawal, and were treating it like a medical condition rather than a moral failing. But if you think designer drug labs were wild, wait until I tell you about what happened when Romans got their hands on biological weapons disguised as food.
Romans didn't just drink wine, they weaponized it. They discovered something called mad honey that was so potent they used it to destroy entire enemy armies. Picture this. Bees feeding on certain types of rhododendron flowers produce honey containing gynotoxins, natural psychoactive compounds that cause hallucinations, dizziness, and complete loss of consciousness. Roman generals would deliberately leave barrels of this mad honey where enemy forces would find it, then attack when the entire opposing army was tripping out of their minds and puking their guts out. That's right, Romans were conducting biological warfare using psychedelic honey. They turned bees into weapons of mass destruction. But their relationship with regular wine was equally insane. Roman wine experts could taste a single drop and tell you not only what year it was made, but which specific hillside the grapes grew on. It was like having superpowers, except the superpower was being a functional alcoholic. They genuinely believed moderate wine consumption would make you stronger in battle and more successful with romantic partners. But here's the thing about Romans, they didn't do moderate. Enter Pliny the Elder, basically the world's first addiction counselor, except he was documenting alcoholics 2,000 years before we had the concept. This man was writing detailed medical reports about people who literally believed there was nothing in life worth living for except drinking.
His symptom list reads like a modern medical textbook. Pale skin, drooping eyes, hands shaking constantly, brutal hangovers, terrible sleep, and, this is a direct quote, dreams of monstrous lustfulness and forbidden delights. He was basically describing ancient rock stars, except these weren't musicians. They were senators, generals, and wealthy merchants making decisions that affected millions of people while absolutely hammered. Mark Antony, the same guy who hooked up with Cleopatra and nearly conquered the world, total drunk. This man was making military strategies that could reshape the Mediterranean while completely wasted on wine. But wine was amateur hour compared to what the most powerful people in Rome were really addicted to.
You're about to learn something that will completely change how you think about Roman leadership. The most philosophically minded emperor in Roman history, Marcus Aurelius, the guy who wrote about self-control and stoic virtue, was secretly a hardcore opium addict. Every single morning, this man who controlled 60 million people would mix opium with honey and consume it under strict medical supervision. His personal physician, Galen, would adjust the dosage daily to make sure Aurelius could sleep at night without being too impaired to make life or death decisions during the day. When Marcus Aurelius tried to quit cold turkey, he suffered what Galen called dry humors, basically ancient terminology for brutal withdrawal symptoms. Without opium, the emperor couldn't function. He couldn't address his troops, couldn't prepare for battle, couldn't think clearly enough to run the most powerful empire in human history. Think about that. The most powerful person in the ancient world was microdosing opiates while writing philosophical meditations about virtue and self-discipline. The same man preaching temperance was literally dependent on drugs to get through each day. But opium wasn't just medicine, it was the perfect assassination tool.
55 AD. Emperor Nero is throwing a dinner party, and his 13-year-old stepbrother Britannicus is the guest of honor. What Britannicus doesn't know is that Rome's most notorious poison maker, a woman named Locusta, has spiked his drink with precision-dosed opiates. Picture the scene. They're all laughing, eating, drinking, when suddenly Britannicus stops talking mid-sentence. His voice disappears. He can't breathe. He falls into a coma right there at the dinner table in front of everyone. And then he dies, possibly weeks later in agony, all because Nero wanted to eliminate a political rival. The Romans had turned the same drug that helped emperors sleep into the ultimate political weapon. One dinner party, one poisoned cup, and the entire line of succession could be rewritten. And here's something that would shock modern society. Suicide by opium was completely legal and considered honorable. Elderly Romans or those suffering from chronic pain would often choose to slip away from this life on a gentle wave. It was seen as a dignified, peaceful exit from a brutal world. But if you think opium was the wildest drug in their arsenal, you haven't heard anything yet. Because Romans had access to plants so potent they could drive you permanently insane.
Walking into a Roman pharmacy was like entering a psychedelic nightmare. They had shelves full of Mandrake, belladonna, wormwood and henbane, plants that could send you on trips so intense they'd make modern festival drugs look like children's vitamins. Let's talk about hellebore. This plant was considered a cure for insanity, but it was so potent it could literally drive you insane if you took too much. And here's where things get historically wild. Emperor Caligula once made a joke that reveals he knew more about medical dosing than most modern doctors. When a senator had been taking hellebore for mental illness, Caligula quipped, "A bloodletting was necessary for one whom hellebore had not benefited in all that time." This wasn't random madness, this was sophisticated medical knowledge. Caligula understood proper therapeutic duration, alternative treatments, and drug interactions. But wormwood was the real killer. Romans turned this into a special wine that was supposed to boost creativity and reduce anxiety. It contains thujone, a compound that increases self-confidence, but is also a potent neurotoxin that can literally destroy your nervous system. Here's where things get historically terrifying. The philosopher Lucretius, known for his brilliant writings, may have been driven completely insane by a wormwood mixture his own wife gave him. The stuff attacks your central nervous system, and according to historical records, this fact seems to have completely eluded the Romans.
They were basically microdosing brain poison while thinking it made them smarter. And daffodils, those innocent spring flowers in your garden, Romans were using them as hardcore drugs. Pliny noted they had serious pain-killing properties, but also caused intense delirium. Your grandmother's flower bed would have been classified as a controlled substance laboratory in ancient Rome. But the most mind-blowing detail? Magic mushrooms were so popular that even emperors were using them for divine inspiration. Picture the most powerful people in the ancient world making political decisions while experiencing full psychedelic hallucinations. They were literally governing an empire while tripping on shrooms. And if that's not wild enough, Romans might have been getting high off seafood. There's evidence they consumed dream fish, a Mediterranean sea bream that produces vivid hallucinations when eaten. They turned their dinner into a psychedelic experience. But there's one plant that connects ancient Rome directly to modern culture, and when you hear this story, you'll realize history is way weirder than anyone told you.
This is where Roman drug culture gets really interesting. Remember that laughing weed Pliny wrote about? Yeah, it's exactly what you think it is, cannabis. But Romans didn't just casually smoke it. They turned getting high into a competitive warrior ritual. Roman merchants imported the primo stuff from the Scythians, these hardcore nomadic warriors from Iran who had perfected the ancient art of getting absolutely blazed before battle. Picture this insane scene. Scythian warriors would heat stones until they were red hot, throw cannabis seeds on top, then cover everything with heavy animal skins and crawl underneath. They'd hotbox themselves until they were, and this is a direct historical quote, howling with joy at their vapor bath. These weren't peaceful hippies, these were battle-hardened warriors getting high as part of their military culture. And Romans saw this and were like, "Hold my wine, we need to try that immediately." But here's what's wild about Roman cannabis use. They were already conducting detailed scientific studies on its effects. The physician Dioscorides documented that cannabis messed with people's sex drive, making it perfect for anyone who needs to control their impulses. Basically, they discovered that weed kills your motivation 2,000 years ago. Roman elite was serving cannabis cakes as dessert at fancy dinner parties. Galen wrote that guests would eat them to stimulate an appetite for drinking. And in larger quantities, the cakes sent users' minds into what he called a warm and toxic vapor. So wealthy Romans were ending their banquets with cannabis edibles, then drinking more wine while high. They were essentially throwing ancient versions of modern party scenes, except they were doing it while running the most powerful empire in human history. Pliny literally called it the laughing weed because when you mixed it with wine, people would break into uncontrollable fits of joy and laughter. Think about this. The same civilization that built the Colosseum, created advanced engineering, and conquered half the known world was also hotboxing tents and giggling uncontrollably at parties. They were getting absolutely blazed while building monuments that still exist today. But this is when you realize the most insane part of this entire story.
Everything we've covered so far was just the warm-up, because when Roman emperors combined absolute power with unlimited access to drugs, the results were so depraved they make modern scandals look like Sunday school picnics. Let me tell you about Nero's lake orgy, an event so shocking it redefined what human beings were capable of. Nero and his corrupt Praetorian prefect, Tigellinus, didn't just throw a party, they turned an entire lake into a floating city of debauchery. They built taverns and brothels on rafts, stocked them with women from every social class, prostitutes, slaves, noble wives, and made them available to anyone who wanted them. This wasn't a private party. This was a public spectacle where the Emperor of Rome was demonstrating that he could turn the entire city into his personal pleasure den. The event ended with Nero staging a mock wedding to a male freedman named Pythagoras in front of the entire crowd. Tacitus wrote that this was Nero symbolically turning Rome itself into a decadent cesspool where every social boundary had been obliterated. But here's the part that'll really mess with your head. Caligula might have been even worse, or he might have been the most brilliant political satirist in history, depending on how you read the evidence.
The famous story about Caligula planning to make his horse Incitatus a consul, there's no contemporary evidence this actually happened. Modern historians think it was a brutal political joke. Caligula telling the Senate their job was so meaningless that even a horse could do it. The bizarre command to collect seashells as spoils of victory against the ocean, probably not insanity. It was likely punishment for legions that had been on the verge of mutiny. He was humiliating them by forcing them to perform the most ridiculous military action imaginable. Caligula wasn't necessarily insane. He might have been using absurd theatre to demonstrate his absolute power over people who hated him. Every ridiculous command was a test. I can make you do literally anything, no matter how stupid, because I am your emperor. But there's another explanation that's even more terrifying. Modern medical analysis suggests Caligula might have been suffering from chronic lead poisoning. Roman elites consumed massive quantities of wine sweetened with sapa, a grape syrup boiled in lead pots that created highly toxic lead acetate. The symptoms of lead poisoning are cognitive disorders, irritability, anxiety,
paranoia, and erratic behavior. Sound familiar? Caligula's personality change after his mysterious illness matches lead poisoning symptoms perfectly. So the mad emperor might not have been mad at all. He might have been slowly dying from heavy metal toxicity while trying to govern an empire. His cruelty and paranoia weren't signs of insanity, but rational responses to genuine threats, filtered through a brain damaged by toxic wine.
Think about everything we just uncovered. An entire empire spanning 3 continents where drug use wasn't just accepted, it was woven into medicine, religion, politics, and imperial governance at the highest levels. While modern society debates legalization, the Romans had already created sophisticated distribution networks, understood tolerance and withdrawal, developed designer drug cocktails, and integrated psychoactive substances into their military, medical, and social systems. But here's the real kicker. Most of the wild and degenerate stuff we think we know about Rome comes from politically motivated character assassination. Senators who hated the imperial system used stories of sexual deviance and drug-fueled madness to attack emperors they couldn't openly oppose. The same sources that gave us tales of Caligula's horse consul and Nero's orgies were written by men with clear political agendas, decades after the events they described. They turned personal vice into political commentary, using degeneracy as a metaphor for the corruption of absolute power.
The reality is more complex and more terrifying than the myths. Marcus Aurelius wasn't evil. He was a functioning addict, trying to manage chronic pain while running the world. Caligula might not have been insane. He might have been a victim of heavy metal poisoning, whose brain was literally being destroyed by toxic wine. Nero wasn't just a sadistic monster. He was a narcissistic performer who turned the entire Roman Empire into his personal stage. The real lesson isn't about drugs making people evil. It's about what happens when unlimited power meets human psychology. The most dangerous intoxicant in Rome wasn't opium or wine. It was absolute, unchecked authority over millions of people. The Romans didn't just conquer the world while high. They showed us what happens when power becomes the ultimate drug. And there's no rehab program for megalomania. If this completely shattered everything you thought you knew about ancient history, make sure you hit subscribe, because we're diving into more forbidden historical truths that will make you question every single thing they taught you in school. What's the most shocking part of Roman drug culture that blew your mind? Drop a comment below. I read every single one, and some of these stories sound too crazy to be real, but they're all documented historical facts. History is way more twisted and fascinating than anyone ever told us.